Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our ISCA ICAN webinar. Today, we are covering updated ASCA Student Standards, Mindsets and Behaviors for Student Success, and we have ISCA President-elect Courtney Cook, who also works for the Prairie Lakes AEA. Before I hand it over to Courtney, I'll just let everyone know if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. Courtney is going to address those as they come in or at the end, whenever they're most appropriate in her presentation. We are recording this presentation. It will be available on the ISCA and the ICAN websites by the end of the week. So again, thank you for joining us. And Courtney, it is all yours.
Sorry about that. My little Zoom bar disappeared for a moment, so I couldn't unmute myself. Thank you so much for the introduction, Brittany. And yeah, I'm Courtney. I'm excited to be here with you all today to review the updated ASCA Student Standards, Mindsets and Behaviors for Student Success. As Britt mentioned, I am the ISCA President-elect and also Prairie Lakes AEA Social Emotional Behavioral Health Coordinator. Within that role, I'm also the school counseling co-lead. And prior to my role with Prairie Lakes AEA, I was a 6 through 12 school counselor at a district in Northwest Iowa. All right, let's get going. So if you weren't familiar or aware yet that the Mindsets and Behaviors received a revision this year, this is a good chance to look that over as they went live this summer during ASCA. But today's sessions are first and foremost visiting those revisions. So explore the few revisions that were made. And as you'll see, the number 36 will look at the new standard as it grew from 35 mindsets and behaviors to 36 student standards. We will discuss implementation of the standards and also look to where we can find additional resources. Hopefully at that time, we can also have some discussion and collaborate within the chat box of how you implement or how you might collaborate with others in your building. And connected to that, we will go through a brief crosswalk with the ASCA Student Standards and Iowa Social Emotional Learning Competencies. And so let's go ahead. So first up, if you haven't already found the updated student standards, you can find them within the ASCA website. And I'm also going to share a QR code at the end to a folder of resources where the PDF will be in there. Otherwise, if you go into the ASCA website or just Google ASCA Student Standards, you can download them for free right here in the site. If you like fancy printed copies, you can also order them for $1 plus shipping. Probably not practical for our smaller schools, but if you work in a larger district and have a team of school counselors, you might find that that meets your needs best rather than printing them off on your own. And we'll look back at this page for other resources later. All right, so let's talk revisions. As I already mentioned, the 35 mindsets and behaviors became the 36 student standards. And you might ask yourself why, or maybe you really don't even care. But if you really want the detailed version of the why and how the revision process took place, I highly recommend viewing the ASCA webinar. We're not going to go into the really nuts and bolts of the revision process. Just overall, with ASCA's professional and ethical standards, we want to make sure that our standards are reflective of current research, and they take consideration of how are they working for school counselors. What they found was that for the most part, the mindsets and behaviors had a ton of strengths and people liked them. They were easy to use, but there were a few areas for growth. And so one of those areas, which we're going to talk about, was the language. Some of the standards weren't super clear. And within that word standards, what school counselors reported is sometimes there was a barrier collaborating with administrators and or teachers when talking about the mindsets and behaviors, because they'd ask, and I even had this experience when I first came to Prairie Lakes and I was talking with some other consultants. They're like, well, what are your standards? I'm like, well, we have the mindsets and behaviors. I'm like, well, are those adopted standards? I'm like, well, they are our standards. So now it literally says ASCA's student standards, and we hope that that helps you have that communication and leverage with your administration and educators so that they can see that, yes, we are working towards student standards within our comprehensive school counseling programs. So again, we consider the strengths and weaknesses of previous language, also looking at how student standards can influence systemic change and addressed some holes that we're missing. Okay, so visually, you'll notice that we now have a colorful graphic on the first page. So I showed this to you so that if you're ever in your Google Drive and you find the PDF, and gosh, is this the new one or the old one? Right off the bat, you're going to notice if it's the new one based off of the first page. Formerly, there was no image. So if you see a colorful group of kiddos, you know you're on the right track. Also, within that name change, ASCA Student Standards, then Mindsets and Behaviors for Student Success. So visually, that's how page 1 changed. And then within the table of standards, you'll notice visually that the categories within behavior standards or domains are blue, highlighted blue. And then obviously this hole in social skills has now been filled. So now each of those 3 areas has 10 standards. And so it looks very nice and complete. So visually, those are the revisions. Other main revisions, again, are the new student standards are more concise and in some areas more descriptive with the language and using nouns or adjectives to make it actionable. The mindsets we'll look at are reordered, and we'll discuss the why of that. And then again, 3536, there is a new social skill so that there are now 10 standards for social skills like learning strategies and self-management skills. So let's look at the mindsets. First off, as you look at this list, what are you noticing within the order? Went too quickly. So I had my notes on this one. All right, so what you might notice is that mindset 1 stayed the same. So 1 is still 1. Really, we start developmentally with a belief in whole self and a healthy balance of mental, social, emotional, and physical well-being. That has not changed. Mindset 2 shifted down to mindset 4. Mindset 3 shifted up to mindset 2, and it was reworded. And so in the next slide that I just gave you a glimpse of, we're going to look at that rewording of sense of belonging. And then mindset 4 shifted down to mindset 6, and 5 stayed the same. So now as you look through the 6 mindsets, you might notice that what they tried to achieve is that although you could go in a different order, they are in a nice developmental approach. And with mindset 6 ending with post-secondary education, we might focus on that after there's the belief in development, sense of belonging, attitude, confidence, and belief in using abilities to their fullest. So looking at research and feedback from groups, it was recommended to go in this order. And then as I hinted at, mindset standard 2 used to be sense of belonging in the school environment. And what feedback shared or exposed is that some people, although sense of belonging is in self-critical and within Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it was kind of unclear, what does sense of belonging mean? Also, it didn't really connect with others. So having a sense of belonging isn't just for the student themselves, but how it's worded in the new standard, sense of acceptance, respect, support, and inclusion. We want our students to have that for themselves and others. So we want them to have a sense of belonging, but we also want to be sure that with the empathy standard that we'll look at a little bit later, they're able to apply that and have social awareness and relationship skills to also make sure that their classmates, their peers also have a sense of belonging. And so that's probably one of my favorite revisions, actually, out of all the revisions, is really broadening that sense of belonging throughout the school environment. Okay, so now the behaviors. As I mentioned, already filled in that hole. So now there's 36. We're going to go through just a few standards that received wording changes. So the first one being creativity. So you'll find that under learning strategies. What you'll also notice, although many people when writing their lesson plans or action planning would put behavior, learning strategy, with the letters too. Now, right in the handout, it's already labeled that way for us so that we can quickly see which standard this is. So demonstrate creativity. This was one standard that school counselors would report, not really sure where to go with this, like, I'm not an art teacher, I'm not this. Why do students need to demonstrate creativity, or really how? And so now within the new student standard, you'll see that that is expanded upon. And really the learning strategy is that students are able to have a creative approach to learning tasks and problem solving. So they're able to think outside the box. They're able to be independent and recognize that oftentimes there's not one way to do something, and they will be a much stronger learner if they're able to find their own unique approach to learning and problem solving. So that's how creativity was adjusted. Next up, decision-making, also within the learning strategies. So the prior wording was gather evidence and consider multiple perspectives to make informed decision. Now, again, with all of these, we're not starting with the verb of gather, we're starting with the noun. So the decision-making is informed by gathering evidence, the same, getting others' perspectives, and recognizing personal bias. So the considering multiple perspectives was elaborated just on for a little bit. So getting others' perspectives, recognizing personal bias, and recognizing, gosh, I might think this is the right way because it was my idea, and other people's perspectives might inform my decision making. So that is decision making. Relationships. So underneath social skills standard 2 grew from create positive and supportive relationships with other students. You'll see that more adjectives were added to the relationship. So not just positive and supportive, but positive, respectful, and supportive relationships. And then elaborated more on other students. So students who are similar to me, and also students who are different from me. So, prior, a student might say, yeah, I have positive, supportive relationships with other students. I have friends. But if it was always that one circle, we know that that's not really, thinking globally or helping them prepare for, that next step in becoming future ready. And so learning how to have respectful relationships with people other than themselves, super important in becoming future ready and getting ready for life after school. And making the school environment more positive, right? All right, so also under social skills is advocacy. And, this really already touches on that first mindset of ensuring that others have a sense of belonging. but the behavior around that is how do I, ensure that sense of belonging? And then when I recognize someone doesn't have a sense of belonging, what can I do? And so already we had the advocacy standard, demonstrate advocacy skills and ability to assert self when necessary. We really added, again, was and others. So not only am I going to advocate for myself, but I'm going to have advocacy skills for self and others, and ability to assert self when necessary. So again, yes, we want them to speak out for themselves and have that sense of belonging, but we want to be able to help our school environments by ensuring students also use their advocacy skills for other students. And lastly, the new cultural standards. So underneath social skills, standard 10 now is cultural awareness, sensitivity, and responsiveness. So, to layer on, we're already talking about, building relationship skills with students who are different than me, but really being direct, that we want our students to have cultural awareness, that people are different and cultures are different, and that's awesome. So having sensitivity and responsiveness based on those cultural differences is social skill number 10. David, I'm seeing your question. Do you know the rationale for getting rid of the verbs, the wording, and starting with nouns? I'm going to go back to this slide. Okay, so part of it is, I flew past this. Thank you for asking that question. So you'll notice at the top here in the old version, it said students will demonstrate the following standards through classroom lessons, activities, and or individual small group counseling, and that was it. And so then that was what the students were doing. And now the behavior standards up here, it talks about school counselors providing culturally sustaining instruction, appraisal, and advisement, and counseling to help all students demonstrate these things. So it's like finishing the sentence, and now all of these standards, since it shifted to standards, it's modeling after how other content areas have standards. And so these are the skills. And so no longer is it the action of it, the verb, but these are what the standards are. You're welcome. Hopefully that answered the question. If not, we can circle back at it at the end. Okay. Actually, that's a great question. Any other questions about the revisions before we lead into implementation? It's so hard not seeing your faces. I'm not as familiar with the webinar format of Zoom. I'm not seeing anything in chat though. So I'm going to go ahead into implementation. So we're going to now look at, and consider how do we implement these standards, writing objectives, knowing how to access resources for and sharing objectives, and then advocating for systemic change. And we're going to talk a lot about leadership and really our professional standards for utilizing the student standards. Okay. So let's just, put this out there. If we look back to our ASCA school counselor professional standards and competencies, best practice of what we should be doing in our comprehensive school counseling programs. First of all, and I just screenshotted, pulled out, a few chunks out of the professional standards and competencies. As school counselors, first and foremost, we are to be self-assessing our own mindsets and behaviors. So take out those student standards and even self-assess, how am I doing at this? I love this part of it because it also mirrors what all educators should be doing with social emotional learning. As we are implementing school-wide SEL, the adults should also be practicing and growing in adult social emotional learning. So this mirrors that effort really well, because you got to ask yourself, how can I teach and model these standards if I don't myself take a moment to reflect on my mindsets and behaviors and grow in areas. So that's first. Second level of implementation, of course, within a lot of the behavior standards for professional school counselors, you'll see implementation. But I highlighted these specific ones as they call out the mindsets and behaviors. So when we're setting up the foundation of our counseling program, we should be using the mindsets and behaviors to inform the implementation, right? We should also be looking at a framework. If you're familiar with hatching results, not just MTSS, but we can look at the MTMDSS and, look at this as a multi-domain, and still these standards should be applied to the 3 domains of school counseling. But so first of all, let's look at what we're doing universally. Let's get that action plan template. We're going to look at it in just a little bit, or remind you where you can find that. In the scope of, whether or not we're K-12, whether or not we're, 6-12, 9-12, if we get together in our teams, what are we doing across the grade span universally to ensure all these mindsets and behaviors are taught and supported? Second, when we consider our direct and indirect student services, we want to be sure we're designing and implementing instruction that's aligned to the student's success. And you'll notice, okay, so I got to call this out. Of course, the professional standards haven't yet received the revision. So you're going to see that it's worded the former language. Just ignore that. It's student standards, right? So we're going, all of our large group classroom individual lessons should be designed utilizing the student standards, from the objectives to the lesson. We want to be sure we're using that. And then planning and assessment, help inform our counseling program, helping us, align with MTSS and finding interventions. We need to develop action plans aligned with student outcome goals and student data. So we are going to talk about that when we get to collaboration in this section, and action planning of what data should be or could you be using to implement those action plans. When I share the resources, you can read this more on your own. This was in the ASCA webinar, and it was a nice reminder, hey, we've got our 4th edition ASCA national model books, hopefully all of us on the shelves, and they go into implementation in more depth. What we should be doing to identify need, select standards, and then write learning objectives. But really the nuts and bolts of it is this flow chart. So we need to identify need, collect supplemental data to ensure, okay, can this need be narrowed down? How many grade levels? Is this a large group intervention? Is this a small group intervention? Is this a one-on-one intervention? We're going to deliver the student standard with a learning objective. We should be collecting pre and post data, and then we can be reflecting then on that data for improvement. What I appreciate with this table is kind of reminding yourself of, okay, I select the student standard, and we're going to practice this on our own in just a moment. But in this case, if the school counselor selected social skill 10, along with the learning strategy 7, that students are going to become more culturally aware, sensitive, and responsive. They're also going to develop long and short-term academic, career, and social emotional goals. Well, what's really an objective or lesson? What do I really want them to achieve specifically? And so here are a few sample student learning objectives. Students will analyze the harmful impact of bias and injustice on the school. And what I like to think of this is now is time for the verb. This is what they're going to be doing to practice and grow in this area. This is how they are going to demonstrate achievement in this standard. So to demonstrate to either me as the school counselor or to their students that they're becoming more culturally aware, I'm going to create a lesson where they analyze the harmful impact of bias and injustice on the school. Or if maybe you're part of a building leadership team or a PBIS team, and feedback from the teachers are just like, gosh, you know what? The students aren't turning in assignments. They just don't seem to even care if they pass at the end of school. I don't even think they really get, the why of graduation. They're just not connecting to long-term goals, or maybe you're trying to supplement your ICAP plan with some school counseling lessons. So in order to help achieve the learning strategy or learning skill of long and short-term academic goals, you could develop a lesson where students determine 3 personal career possibilities and specify the relevant requirements of each. So that particular action could lead to demonstrating success in that student standard. Okay, as mentioned, let's practice. So looking at the behavior standards, first identify a student standard that your student body has demonstrated need in, and go ahead and type that in the chat box. And you can totally use something for this activity that you've already done this year. Okay, self-discipline and self-control. Okay, so I'm seeing that self-management skill number 2. Yeah. David, are you in middle school? All right, social awareness, Becky. Jacqueline, responsibility for self and actions. Right, another self-management. Oh, elementary. Also, yes. Effective coping skills. Awesome. Okay, keep them coming. You'll still be able to see the table as I advance. Okay, and you might even need a sheet of paper to think through this. So now we are going to make sure I click up on the screen. So now we're going to consider a potential learning objective for that standard. What I find is most helpful is thinking first about a lesson. So let's think about, let's see, effective coping skills or cultural awareness, sensitivity, and responsiveness. I just have a tough time coming up with examples on the fly. I was going to try to get fancy and have you all use the whiteboard, but I don't think that's an option within the webinar and highlight some of these. But if you're keeping track in the chat box, you can do that also. So effective coping skills, let's go with that one. So I might think of, maybe they're having trouble transitioning from recess back into the classroom, possibly after some conflict at recess. I heard that come up in a recent facilitation of crisis prevention. And so let's say that students are having a tough time coping and transitioning from recess with conflict back in the classroom. Or maybe you're thinking of middle school drama here. I'm not quite sure where David's going with the coping skills, but I'm thinking about, okay, can they transition from recess back to the classroom, especially when there's conflict, and cope with that frustration? So I might think of lesson with a book. Maybe I pair up a book about frustration. And I was not an elementary school counselor, so I don't even know I went here with my example. And I might say something like, students will demonstrate self-regulation by utilizing the coping skill of triangle breathing during conflict. That could probably be improved on a lot, but on the fly, that's going to be one of my first drafts of this. Okay. So now thinking back to the standard you selected, go ahead and type in the chat box a potential learning objective for that standard. And maybe you don't think in reverse of the lesson with the learning objective. Maybe you just want to think straight into the learning objective of how would they demonstrate that they have this skill. I'll give you a few moments to think about that. I should have went with empathy. I've got an objective right for that in my brain. I know this is tough, and you probably weren't thinking that at 5 o'clock you would be writing learning objectives. So I'll give a little bit more wait time for that chat box, and then we'll move forward. Okay, students will be able to demonstrate respect and support with other students during the empathy activity. You're in my boat if. Awesome, thanks. Students will demonstrate awareness of words and symbols. My chat box moved, that are offensive and hurtful to members of other groups and refrain from using them. Okay, awesome. Students will identify, demonstrate specific things they can do when they feel like things aren't going their way. Okay. And students will recognize which zone they are in and utilize an appropriate coping skill to move back to the green zone. All right. So that Janie must use zones of regulation. Awesome. Students will demonstrate self-control during peer conflicts by utilizing common strategies. Awesome, David. Thanks so much for practicing with me today. So something that ASCA rolled out this summer during the national conference and the rollout of the updated student standards is the student standards database. It can be found on the same page you download the student standards. What I'll share with you is that there's still not a ton of objectives in there. I think there's literally like 36, maybe 40 objectives. But when you do go in there, what you can do is search for a learning objective. So, you know, if you first identify the area of need, and maybe you're hearing feedback or you're recognizing in your SIS or system or behavior referrals that, oh gosh, we need an area of self-management, you could either use a search term or search filter by the standards. I would say, since there aren't a ton of objectives in there right now, it probably would work best to just kind of filter by standards or even scroll through the list as are now, or as is there now. What ASCA would appreciate is for school counselors to start submitting learning objectives. And so, oh gosh, my screenshot cut that off. Right above this submitted area is a tab. So you're staying on the same page, but actually I might be able to, yes, I can show you going into the tab. So you would just toggle between search and submit on the same page, of whether you want to look for a potential objective or if you've completed a lesson and have some objectives ready to upload into the system. ASCA would really appreciate that collaboration and support for other school counselors. All right, so as I mentioned, action planning is something that we should all be doing, and you can access the action plan template right here on the same page. So maybe you want to use this template first to action plan out your universal tier, your tier 1 lessons, making sure you're hitting all of the student standards at some point. Or maybe you want to action plan based on your district goals and initiatives. There is a template for you to do that. And there also are, I'm going to share how to download additional templates, like the lesson plan template is still available as well. Okay, so again, just to reference, as professional school counselors, it's within our professional standards to identify gaps, use data to inform our decisions and our action planning. And we want to be sure that we're developing our goals based on our student data. So not based off of necessarily this is the order I do it every year, or based off a calendar I got off Teachers Pay Teachers. I want to be sure that I'm identifying goals based on my student body, based on what they need. And then through that, I'm going to determine what do I teach in large group and classroom settings, and then what interventions do I need to be rolling out in small group and individual. And then as needed, I'm providing that short-term counseling in the small group and individual settings. And that can all be done through action planning. Okay, so here's the additional templates. This will also be linked into the slide deck when you access the resource folder if you're not aware of this page. But if you download or click here, you're actually downloading a zip file or a folder of all of the ASCA National Model templates. Within there, you're going to find the action planning. Still, of course, the time use calendar and all those templates, but within there is also a lesson planning template that's really useful to use. All right, so now we're going to talk about leadership and systemic change. How can we leverage these student standards for systemic change? Within our professional standards, it's within our foundation, and we should be advocating for systemic change and leading that when we recognize deficits and disparities within our data. So we can do this through both direct and indirect service. So when you're recognizing that there is a discrepancy or a disparity within maybe subgroups, if you recognize that a certain subgroup is either maybe being referred to the office for certain behaviors more than other students, you might find, okay, I need to develop some small group or individual lessons for this direct service. Or maybe I recognize that, oh gosh, this subgroup is getting referred for these behaviors. But when I observe a classroom, I am noticing that those behaviors are also being exhibited by other students. And so through indirect counseling service, I can use my leadership and advocacy to address underlying systemic issues, because the issue might not be the students. The issue might be in classroom environment or what adults are noticing and what they're responding to. And so within my role as a professional school counselor, I also need to use my leadership and advocacy to say, you know what? It's not so much that this subgroup needs individual or small group lessons. I need to be coming in and maybe collaborating with the classroom teacher on some classroom or large group lessons. And also maybe ensuring that we are having those tough conversations of why is this subgroup receiving referrals? Why are you concerned with their behaviors and not this other group? All right. Any questions with implementation before we rock and roll through a speedy crosswalk of SEL? If I'm rushing wait time and someone's still typing, go ahead, finish your sentence, press return or enter, and I'll pause and come back to it. Otherwise, we'll move forward into the crosswalk. So, this last, I can't even say year and a half anymore. I've lost count of how many months we've been in the pandemic. It has really, shown a spotlight, right, on the social emotional needs of students and the needs for supporting social emotional behavioral health. This is awesome. We know as school counselors that many of the needs are not new, right? It's been there. But within the collective trauma we've been experiencing, there's increased need by students, and also as educators and professionals, we're getting worn down. Our threshold for tolerance is shrinking. And so, with all of that I'm appreciative of the little bit of spotlight, and we need to rock and roll with it. But it has left some people confused, maybe, of okay, so now we have this school-wide social emotional learning. What's my role in that? And why do I then still have these outside student standards? Like what should I follow? So we're going to crosswalk and talk about that a little bit in these next slides. We still want to be sure we have a comprehensive school counseling program and that we're still following our student standards and the writing of our lessons and our action planning, but we can most definitely connect to the Iowa social emotional learning competencies and be grateful that these competencies are being embedded into the full school day. We should be grateful if our teachers are implementing social emotional learning strategies into their lessons, and support them with that and collaborate. But we want to be sure that we know the connections so that we can be more specific, because we know self-awareness, that's a very big picture, and we can look to, first of all, our mindset. So within our standards, first, let's look at the 6 mindsets. And the first mindset being belief in the development of whole self. It's really a self-awareness competency. So, if the teachers have identified, or if the school's identified, we need some growth in self-awareness, then you can look to the mindsets first, like really what mindset is it, and filter that down a little bit more. Sense of acceptance. Now that this, now that the sense of belonging mindset has been really more defined into the sense of acceptance, respect, support, and inclusion for all students, and not just for us, it really moves beyond self-awareness, and we're also tapping into social awareness. So it's looking at both sets of competencies. Positive attitude towards work and learning, very much self-awareness. We want our students to be aware of their attitude and how we can shift. I could go on a squirrel here, but I'm going to reframe myself and make sure that we end on time. We might come back to that one in a little bit. All right, wrapping up the last 3 mindsets. Again, all of these are very much self-aware. That's what mindset is, right? Being aware of our mindsets. But again, this last one, understanding the post-secondary education and lifelong learning. Within that, there's still a touch of social awareness, right? Because we're tapping into civic awareness. So not only understanding that post-secondary education is needed for my long-term success, hopefully the students are also touching into the social awareness of post-secondary education and careers, and connecting to something that's serving the larger picture and their community as a whole. Okay, if we go into behaviors and first look at the learning strategies, we'll see that most of the learning strategies connect with responsible decision making and self-management. So I'll give you a moment to connect with the first 5 behavior learning strategies. It's also important because we could get into like the chicken egg conversation. Do they need the learning strategies first, or the competencies first? Not only will the learning strategies help them build their social emotional learning competencies, it's important to recognize as the school counselor, if I'm working in the learning strategy of time management and organizational study skills, I need to recognize that requires a lot of self-management. And so, having that empathy piece, if I know that the students still have weakness in there, or as an educator, I'm going to have that empathy piece and some patience and help them develop time management that will also impact their self-management. Also, you might already be thinking, gosh, these learning standards tie really closely with executive functioning. And as we go through this crosswalk, we'll touch on other sets of standards that you can utilize to collaborate with teachers. But also you may be recognizing that obviously there's a natural crosswalk with other sets of skills like executive functioning. And that hopefully doesn't confuse you and frustrate you, but hopefully adds that that lens again, especially if the students are struggling in certain areas. There may be some lagging skills. You might be able to tap into other resources to help them manage the time management, especially if you get through some lessons and you discover, okay, as a group, this class has moved forward really well, but we have a few students that are just still really struggling. Maybe after some short-term counseling, you realize, you know what? I've kept my data. We need to consider some referrals for the student. They're just still not making growth. And so that information can help you collaborate with either an AEA representative or your special education team to recognize there might be something else going on here. Okay, I went on a soapbox there. Second set, or the last 5 of the learning strategies are shown here now, again, mostly connected with self-management and responsible decision-making, very much leading into the learning strategies. Give you a moment to glance at these. And if it's been a while since the last time you looked at the mindsets and behaviors, you might be, as you're looking through this list, hopefully you're also realizing and recognizing your area of influence within your school. You might be recognizing, oh my gosh, these are a lot of skills that our teachers have been complaining about, or just recognizing, gosh, our students are rushing through assignments, or like specialists on high standards of quality. Gosh, they're submitting assignments and not completing them. We can help with that. So if you found yourself in a school where you have more assigned duties or duties as assigned, and you haven't been able to really focus on developing a comprehensive school counseling program, this is your area for leverage. This is your area to make sure that you're protecting your time and using your time wisely. Okay, self-management skills. So we're moving from the learning strategies over to self-management. So obviously still self-management competencies and responsible decision-making are key social emotional learning competencies. Within the folder, I also have the PDF for the Iowa Social Emotional Learning Competencies. So if you're not as familiar with that, or it's been a while since you looked through that, how it's broken down, what's really helpful for your collaboration with the classroom teachers is that in this fall revision, they have it broken down into grade spans, and there's still some columns where there is suggested teacher activities. So you can have a conversation with the teacher on, I can help the students with independent work, but within the self-management area, these are some tips and some strategies that you can also be doing to help support the students learning how they can grow in independent work. And then the last 5, again, all connected to self-management and responsible decision-making. Before moving forward, just hitting on, for those of us, a little middle school, but really our high school and secondary school counselors, something that many of your students might struggle with is finding that balance of school, home, and community activities. And that does require a great deal of responsible decision-making. It also involves a partnership with parents. So just a side note, and maybe this will be a later webinar, hopefully within your comprehensive school counseling program and your collaboration with educators, you're also touching on how are we building that bridge to home? How are we making that more of a partnership and a bi-directional partnership, knowing that, parents can come forward and guardians can come forward with not just questions, but also suggestions, and that they have that power to do so. And how can we confidently and comfortably share resources with our parent partners so that they can best support the students in this responsible decision making, and recognizing that there are a lot of demands on our students at home and within the community, and if they're involved in a lot of school activities, sometimes it's not easy to make those decisions. So hopefully that's in the back of your mind also, of how can I make this a wraparound program and be supporting our students in all learning environments. All right, moving into social skills, maybe it's not, a shock to you that many of the social skills within the ASCA behaviors and learning strategies, and I'm recognizing that I did not update this table. That's why my brain has been thrown off. I will fix that and re-upload the PDF for all of you. So what I was saying, it's probably not a shock that social skills relies heavily on relationship skills and social awareness within the Iowa social emotional learning competencies. It also requires some responsible decision making, especially when we get to advocacy and demonstrating ethical decisions and social responsibility. Not only do they need to be aware of, the culture around them, be aware of what their peers need. They also need to be able to, form the relationships and make responsible decisions. And the last 5, saying we have 10 minutes left, I think we're going to make it. I'm just going to move forward for that sake of time. The remaining 5 social skills, very much connected again to social awareness and relationship skills. So why we do this crosswalk again is to connect our set of professional student standards with what our school-wide SEL implementation is doing. And so maybe you're a part of that implementation and you are leading which lessons are each month, but maybe that's being led by a different teacher leader group, but you can supplement additional school counseling lessons in, because we know one curriculum is not the full social emotional learning implementation. One curriculum really is not the full school counseling program. We definitely need to be coming at this from multiple angles, and the student standards can really help you be more specific with your lessons and interventions and make that growth needed to, turn some of those maybe problems or barriers within your student data around. So that we're not just predicting what's going to happen, we're disrupting the prediction, especially when it comes to, particularly maybe, like within what you dropped in the chat boxes, already areas of need, like coping skills and relationship and conflict resolution. If we know that's a problem, let's find this the standard that addresses it and start working on it, and not just say, well, I bet they're going to get in a fight at recess again. Let's disrupt the prediction. All right, so lastly, I touched on or hinted at collaboration, not just with the SEL implementation that could be happening within your district, but if you're noticing data needs or student needs within one either classroom or one content area, or maybe one teacher has asked for help, what you could do is collaborate with them, take a look at their standards and see where some of these naturally fit. Obviously, the learning strategies fit in a lot of areas, right? The responsible decision making and able to set goals and get assignments turned in or use creativity to complete the assignments. But there are areas for collaboration, like the social skills, for instance, taking a look at the literacy standards. Within their literacy standards, students need to be able to identify the emotions of characters. And so you could collaborate on a lesson with them, and you pick your school counseling student standard, they pick their literacy standard, and you put that together to have that. What is even more powerful is if you could do a cross-content collaboration. And at the same time, the social studies teacher could also be connecting and like, oh, you're reading that story in English. This is our unit in social studies. We can combine a project in that area. And then the school counselor comes in and says, you know what, in order to do that, the students need to be able to demonstrate this social skill maybe, and I could come in and add even more flair, if you will, and just make that a little bit more deeper, and add context, because what we really know is that students learn best when the learning is relevant, when it makes sense to them, and if they're having more personal growth in that, there is going to be more success all around in multiple subject areas. And then you're just not the school counselor in that one office that sometimes students go to. The more we can be seen, the more important it is. And it's within, again, I'm going to hit these professional standards also, is that we should be using the mindsets and behavior, the student standards, mindsets and behaviors to inform the implementation. And we should be collaborating with families, teachers, administrators, and other stakeholders for that success. So not just within the other educators, as I hinted a few slides ago, we need to be collaborating with families and making sure that they have the supports at home also. All right, so with 5 minutes left, any questions? Where can we find the crosswalk? So ASCA has not published the crosswalk yet. It's still in development, but I will put this in a nice PDF also, as it's really a starting guide. So, oh my gosh, Linda Lynn just dropped in the chat box. She's my hero, everyone. And like, oh, thank you, Linda. I haven't read your whole chat yet, message, but just seeing your name brighten my day. Anyway, what I was saying, so the crosswalk will be in the slide deck, which will be in the folder. So here's the QR code on this slide. Let me know right away if it's not working or if I need to readjust the privacy settings. I think I have it set right that QR code should get you to a folder of resources. In there right now is the PDF of the slide deck, the updated student standards, the professional school counselor standards, and the Iowa social emotional learning competencies. But I will add some more resources, and I will type up the crosswalk in a little bit more neat and tidy way. But you might take it and add even more detail to it. So I'll put it as a PDF and a Google Doc, so you can make a copy of it and maybe add your own details to that as you work through that. And then, hopefully sometime soon, ASCA also shares it. What I do want to let you know is if you go into the ASCA Student Standards, and I'll just go ahead and share this with you. This will open up first. Within the ASCA Student Standards, they do share the crosswalk with, oh no, it's not in this one. It might be in a different document. I'll get it. They do a crosswalk with, it's not teaching tolerance anymore, but there's a cultural crosswalk that I thought it was right within here. I'll get that and add that to the resource also, because that's super helpful. Crosswalk if you've seen those other standards. Any other questions or comments? Requests for more resources? So I would say, and Linda, you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if, because this is where myself and the other consultant kind of was, I was like, what do you mean adapted the recognized standards? What the Department of Education has done is recognized that a school should have a professional school counselor as defined by ASCA. I don't know if they've also literally said that the ASCA Student Standards are our school counseling standards. It's implied, but I don't know for sure. I will get a specific answer to that because in my mind, yes, they have. You know, they refer to ASCA on the school counseling site, you know, by saying that we need school counselors licensed as defined by ASCA. But what I have found is that the official adoption of standards is much more fancier and in more depth than what I realized. So I will find out for sure if I can use the language adopted the standards or if it's simply implied. You know, they recommend that we use ASCA's resources. They recommend or they endorse ISCA as the organization to support school counselors. And, you know, we can use the ASCA school counselor evaluation supplement and should use that as our evaluation. So I don't see, no one should have a problem with these student standards is what I'm saying, but I don't know if I can say they've adopted it. You're welcome. I will find out though. Might be opening a can of worms, but I'm brave. All right, it's 5:30. I will hang on if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, we'll probably stop the recording. Thank you once again. I'll go back to this slide in case you didn't capture that QR code for resources or grab my email, but feel free to give a shout out. Thank you, Linda, for recommending or adding that little comment. Yeah, it's a can of worms. You're very welcome.
Okay, well, I want to thank Courtney for taking the time and thank all of you for joining us for this important discussion. It's always important to follow up when standards change and things are updated, and we all keep abreast of all these new changes to the profession. So Courtney, thank you for spending your time and putting this together. And I will put the recording out on the websites probably by the end of the day tomorrow. So everyone go, have a great night, and we'll talk to you soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Britt. Thanks again, everyone.